Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kathleen Smith. I'm responsible for the Inquiring Minds monthly series under the auspices of Toronto Mensa. And I'm warmly welcoming you to this Zoom edition of Toronto Mensa Inquiring Minds. Today, it is my pleasure to introduce Professor David Marples, who is the chair of the Department of History and Classics at the University of Alberta. He is speaking to us from Edmonton in Canada. Dr. Marples obtained a PhD in economic and social history from the University of Sheffield in the United Kingdom in 1985. And he has been on the faculty of the University of Alberta since 1991. Because of his expertise on Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine, Dr. Marples has served as a consultant on Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia to a wide array of government and non-government organizations. So, for example, the US Embassy in Minsk, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office of the United Kingdom, the Department of Defense, and the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade in Canada, as well as Voice of America and Radio Free Europe / Radio Liberty. He is a member of the advisory board on Belarus for the German Marshall Fund of the United States. He's on the editorial board for several journals here in Canada and in Europe. He's also honorary president of the Belarusian Academy of Arts and Sciences in Canada. And in March 2022, so recently, he was appointed a research fellow with the Contemporary Ukraine Program, Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies at the University of Alberta. Dr. Marples is the author of 16 single-authored books and 5 edited books on topics ranging from 20th century Russia, Stalinism, contemporary Belarus, contemporary Ukraine, and the Chernobyl disaster. And just before the current Russia-Ukraine conflict started, Dr. Marples published the edited book, The War in Ukraine's Donbass. During our rehearsal for today's webinar, Professor Marples commented that various countries have now prevented graduate students from Belarus from continuing their research. This is unfortunate because these students are not in support of Putin or his actions and are now completely isolated in a country where they are uncomfortable. Professor Marples wonders whether sanctions should be extended against Belarus. So he will take questions about that if you have some, as well, of course, as your questions on other matters related to the talk. Today, Professor Marples' talk is Fighting Genocide or Destroying a Fraternal Nation, an analysis of Russia's attack on Ukraine. Welcome, Professor Marples.
Thank you very much, Kathleen. And hello to everyone who's attending today from, it seems, all parts of Europe and the United States and Canada. I will going to share my screen to show this presentation, and I'll start that now. Okay, so I hope this is visible to everyone. And you can see that I shortened the title because I couldn't get everything on the one slide. So the war in Ukraine began after the Maidan uprising, or 6 years after the Maidan uprising, 8 years after, sorry, that occupied Ukraine and central Kiev for the period from late November 2013 to approximately February 21st, 2015. And the protests resulted a year earlier than that in the departure of President Viktor Yanukovych, new presidential and parliamentary elections in the summer of 2014, the annexation of Crimea by Russia, and the fomenting by Russia of a war in the eastern part of Ukraine. By the late spring of 2014, two breakaway republics had been formed in the eastern part of Donetsk and Luhansk regions, but the majority of East Ukrainian cities rebuffed the attempted takeovers. This conflict was brutal, and it came to a halt of sorts thanks to a Minsk protocol hosted by Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko, initially in September 2014. It was mediated by French and German presidents in what was termed the Normandy format, and signed by Russia, Ukraine, and the OSCE Trilateral Contact Group on Ukraine. But more fighting soon broke out, and a new agreement was signed, a final agreement, or Minsk Protocols 2, on February 12, 2015. And that stipulated the removal of heavy weapons from the battlefield, release of prisoners on both sides, and constitutional reforms in Ukraine, including the provision of autonomy for the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. Ukraine was to regain control over its borders, and early elections were to be held in the two regions. And a period of 8 years followed in which the fighting continued spasmodically, though Russian priorities were redirected to the civil war in Syria and support for the government of Bashar al-Assad. The two breakaway republics were subjected to a trade embargo by Ukraine, but they received supplies from Russia to compensate. Their status as independent states, which was the result of a referendum later in 2014, was recognized only by two breakaway regions of Georgia backed by Russia, and in a similar situation, Abkhazia and South Ossetia. In other words, Russia did not recognize the independence of these states, even though they backed them materially. But in 2019, Russia started to distribute Russian passports to the Donbass residents. And in February 2022, Vladimir Putin announced that Russia recognized the two regions as independent states, including not only the so-called separatist republics, but the rest of those regions that were under Ukraine's control. This recognition effectively ended the two Minsk protocols. Putin then focused attention on what he termed a, quote, genocide of the population of the Donbass by the Kiev government. So the two regions have named themselves the Donetsk People's Republic, or DNR, from the Russian acronym, and the Luhansk People's Republic. But the actual republics are more or less from where these little markers are to the eastern borders. In other words, this western part was under Ukraine's control until the war started. And we're looking here at eastern Ukraine, that is the so-called left bank of the Dnipro River, which flows southward from the Kiev Reservoir to the Black Sea. Look at the situation in Ukraine in 2014 to 21. The period after 2014 was clearly a difficult one for Ukraine. The presidency of Petro Poroshenko began in the summer, and it saw, excuse me, I'm going behind here. It saw more focus on ideology than substantive changes or economic improvement In fact, Ukraine's economy declined to the point where it was declared to be the poorest country in Europe at the end of Poroshenko's presidency, overtaking in that regard equally unfortunate Moldova. Corruption remained a key problem. It had been rampant under Yanukovych in the previous 4 years. And though the associate agreement with the European Union was signed, Ukraine's prospects for actually joining the EU were very distant. In fact, at times, the politics in Ukraine approached farcical levels. In May 2015, Poroshenko invited his old friend, Mikhail Saakashvili, the former president of Georgia, to Ukraine and appointed him the governor of Odessa region with the task of cleaning the city of corruption. But before long, Saakashvili developed broader ambitions, broke off his friendship with Poroshenko, and announced his intention to run for the presidency. In July 2017, his Ukrainian citizenship was then revoked. In December, he was accused of links to an organized crime group working on behalf of the exiled president, Viktor Yanukovych. And eventually, he was deported after a botched initial attempt to arrest him. Subsequently, together with some supporters, he broke through the Polish-Ukrainian border in defiance of Poroshenko before he was eventually detained and deported for a second time. And there are other similar events that seemed to reach this kind of low level of politics. For example, in 2017, Russian journalist Arkady Babchenko, who had reported on Russia's war with Chechnya, moved to Kiev and began to work for the ATR television channel. On May 29th of 2018, there was a report that he'd been assassinated at his home. And focus in the Ukrainian media promptly turned to the Russian FSB, the intelligence services, and their involvement. But the following day, the Ukrainian Security Services, acronym SB, held a press conference, and Babchenko suddenly appeared. The SB announced that it had faked his death in order to uncover the real would-be assassins. It was not a very convincing performance, in other words. On a more serious note, the Belarusian journalist Pavel Sheremet, who was an enemy of both the Belarusian and the Russian leaders, was killed by a car bomb while driving to work in Kiev on June the 2nd of 2016, and no charges were ever brought in that case. Poroshenko sought re-election and ran in 2019 on a patriotic campaign of army, language, and church. In fact, he nationalized the Ukrainian Orthodox Church to break it away from Russia toward the end of his presidency. But he was undermined from the outset of accusations of embezzling millions of dollars, and Ukraine's Anti-Corruption Bureau accused him of taking $1 million in bribes. Minister of the Interior, Arsen Avakov, in turn, accused Poroshenko of using state resources to purchase votes, mostly from pensioners. Poroshenko resorted to new calls to Ukrainian patriots, and after an incident on the Black Sea involving Russian detainment of Ukrainian sailors, he impetuously declared martial law throughout Ukraine in November 2018. But the electorate roundly rejected him and elected instead a political neophyte and TV personality, Volodymyr Zelensky, a Russophone Jew from Kryvyi Rih in eastern Ukraine, who had played the part of an unexpected president in his TV series. Though believed to be a protege of one of Ukraine's most notorious oligarchs, Ihor Kolomoisky, the former governor of Dnipropetrovsk, today it's simply called Dnipro, Zelensky led the first round of the presidential elections in March and defeated Poroshenko in a landslide the following month with around 73% of total votes. And if you look at the election results in Ukraine in 2019, you can see just how decisive this vote was. The dark red here are the votes for Poroshenko, so almost exclusively in the region of Galicia in Western Ukraine. and the rest of the country, other than the two occupied regions of the Donbass and Crimea, overwhelmingly in support of Zelensky. As a president, and maybe expectedly, Zelensky appeared to flounder. After only 6 months, Prime Minister Alexei Honcharuk, at 35, the youngest person ever to fulfill that position, resigned shortly after a leaked media clip exposed him criticizing the president's ignorance of economics. And a new cabinet was appointed under Denis Shmyhal, a Western Ukrainian entrepreneur and accountant who had been the governor of Ivano-Frankivsk region. Honcharuk had initiated a large-scale program of privatization and a staunch campaign to end corruption, perhaps the biggest campaign against corruption ever launched by Ukraine in the independence period. But after 6 months, he was gone. Zelensky had promised to end the fighting in the Donbass, and there was an exchange, rather two exchanges of prisoners, but without any fundamental progress. The attempt to end corruption didn't get very far either. Kolomoisky, sorry, my printer decided to recharge itself, which it does periodically, and I can't do anything about it, but it only lasts for a few seconds. Kolomoisky, exiled in Austria, promptly returned to Ukraine after the election and was often seen at high-level meetings. The ruling party in the parliament, Servant of the People, created just before the parliamentary elections and emulating the same name of the party in the TV series, soon began to fracture. And Poroshenko's party, European Solidarity, and the opposition bloc for life gained some ground accordingly. Zelensky's popularity dropped rapidly from around 70% just after the election to around 30% and even lower. And he began to adopt the sort of national rhetoric, pro-Europe, pro-NATO, anti-Russian, adopted by his predecessor. More specifically, though Zelensky met with European leaders, little progress was made on the recommendations of the Minsk Protocol. The issue of constitutional change and changing the status of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions founded on at least two grounds. First, it appeared to many parliamentarians to be unpatriotic. And second, there was the obvious fact that Ukraine was not in control of the eastern part of both regions, which had declared themselves to be independent states. So there was an understandable reluctance to offer autonomy to regimes led by pro-Russian separatists. Zelensky bizarrely got caught up in the impeachment trial of Donald J. Trump, who had appeared to link the sale of weapons to Ukraine to, quote, digging up dirt, unquote, on the subject of Vice President Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden, who was a director of the Burisma company, a private energy company with Ukrainian owners. Trump's deference to Vladimir Putin and his derogatory remarks about Ukraine added to Zelensky's problems. Zelensky also partially dismissed President Biden's warnings that a Russian invasion of Ukraine was imminent early in 2022, declaring that such information would only lead to panic. Biden, however, was actually disclosing the results of US intelligence. The subsequent Russian invasion of February the 24th justified Biden's warnings, but it also resulted in a sharp rise in the personal standing of Zelensky in Ukraine after he refused to be evacuated from Kiev. He removed his suit, put on a hunting jacket, and declared that he needed weapons and not a ride. Thereafter, Zelensky rose to the occasion, using his greatest asset, which was his social media skills, to appeal to Ukrainians to resist the invader. Some analysts and journalists evoke comparisons with Winston Churchill's speeches during the Battle of Britain, and his popularity rose rapidly to over 90% in opinion polls. He also became the most popular foreign statesperson in the United States, with over 72% of Americans declaring they had confidence in Zelensky in a poll of March 2022. And that was actually the highest Americans had of any world leader, including their own. In many respects, in February 2022, the situation appeared unusually black and white. A predator, an aggressive nuclear weapon state invading a much smaller neighbor, one that had voluntarily given up its own nuclear weapons to Russia in 1994, in exchange for guarantees of its security from Russia, United States, and the United Kingdom under the Budapest Memorandum. The reasons for the invasion lacked any substance. I'll talk more about them a little later. And the savagery with which it was conducted rendered the Russian Federation an international pariah. The invasion also appeared to be an uncharacteristic move for President Putin, who had hitherto expressed imperial views, but had always acted cautiously, even abandoning followers who had advocated the expansion of the Ruski Mir, the Russian world, in 2014. But the war served to eliminate all the concerns that had featured in Ukrainians' domestic politics for much of the independence period. That is corruption, oligarch control of the economy, a sluggish legal system, and political infighting, as well as the presence of some uncontrolled armed groups such as C-14 or the Azov Battalion, which belonged on the far right of the political spectrum. So this map, it's a couple of days old now, so it may be slightly out of date, but it is roughly where we are today. But it doesn't show that the initial part of the war started with an attack from Belarus, where some exercises were taking place between Russian and Belarus troops using live ammunition, which was supposed to end on February the 20th. But in fact, Russian troops then moved southward into Ukraine, heading toward the Chernobyl nuclear power station, which is the first real point here after the city of Pripyat in the north, and then down toward Kiev. But that attack failed as Ukraine's resisted strongly. And after several weeks, the attack was reoriented. These troops were pulled out, leaving evidence of several massacres, and moved to the east to fight in the Donbass. And there was simultaneously an advance from Crimea into Kherson region. The city of Kherson is in fact occupied. It was the first major city to be occupied by Russian forces. On April the 6th, 2022, an article in a Russian newspaper by Alexander Botkaryev made the comparison between the current rule of Vladimir Putin in Russia and the reign of Ivan III. The analogy stemmed from the fact that Russia faced more than one enemy on both occasions. Under Ivan III, it was the Golden Horde, to which it paid tribute, which had come from the east, and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. And today, it's declared to be the United States and the European Union. The article notes that in the earlier period, Russia was able to defeat both enemies, and the period of paying tribute to the Golden Horde ended. And also, Russia occupied 1/3 of the territories of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. And then later, under Peter the Great, these territories were expanded further. The logic of this then is that Russia will occupy Ukraine and other territories in its neighborhood, and Putin will achieve the same sort of status as Ivan III. Botkaryev also noted the presence in the south of the hostile Crimean Khanate, occupying not only the Crimea, but much of today's eastern Ukraine. And he adds an aside that if Russia and China could act in unison today, then the European Union could be dismantled in the same fashion as the Golden Horde. and could then be broken up into small khanates. Putin would then be repeating the history of 600 years ago. In another article in a different Russian source published on April 17, the focus is on the battle for Mariupol, which was soon transformed into the pivotal battle of the war. The enemy in this article is the pro-Nazi Azov battalion, currently holed up in the Azov steelworks at Mariupol, but surrounded by Russian forces. In reality, the role of the Azov battalion is supportive today to back up the defenders of the factory, the 36th Marine Brigade, and troops of the Ukrainian Ministry of the Interior. But the description is reminiscent of the liberation of Stalingrad in 1943, though it doesn't work perfectly because the Germans were never fully in control of Stalingrad. But the narrative is that after 8 years of genocidal policy against Russian populations of the two separatist republics in Donetsk and Luhansk, Russia has stepped in to remove the pro-Nazi rulers and end their reigns of terror. And so here's the picture of the two, Ivan III and Vladimir Putin. And I use these two examples simply to illustrate the depiction of the war from the other side. And even if one can accept that the war brings diverse reporting and that truth is always the first victim, the Russian perspective is so far from Western reporting that we might be dealing with people from another universe. Would one find, for example, today, a Western leader lamenting the end of the British or the French empires, or advocating the reconquest of Africa or India, and correspondingly the physical destruction of one of its component states? In fact, the use of such comparisons is quite close to the thinking of the Russian leadership, particularly Putin, his defense minister Sergei Shoigu, and the rigid foreign minister Sergei Lavrov. Their mission is to restore to Russia the territories of the former empire, though the nature of the military campaigns changed because of the Ukrainian resistance in Kiev and the unimpressive nature of the attack from the north. Officially, Russia's goal is to demilitarize and to denazify Ukraine. And what we've been witnessing is always called a special military operation and not an invasion. The term denazification is also deliberately vague. The existence of the Azov battalion notwithstanding, neo-Nazis play no role today in the leadership of Ukraine. There is no such thinking prescient in the population generally. After all, over 70% of the population voted for a Jewish president in 2019, and at the time of his election, Ukraine also had a Jewish prime minister. And the far right, though it exists, is no more prevalent in Ukraine than it is in the United States, Canada, or for that matter, Russia. But I'll move back now to the Donbass and Mariupol in particular. The Declaration of Independence there, as I mentioned briefly, was carried out in a referendum, but one presided over by gun-toting gangsters. And the two governments formed there expanded slightly in territory in the war that followed. Ukraine's response was called an anti-terrorist operation, or ATO. And both battles that were definitive in this war at Ilovaisk in September 2014 and Debaltseve in February 2015 involved the participation of units or mercenaries from Russia. Putin declared them to be volunteers who were temporarily on holiday from the army. So Kathleen, anytime you want me to take a break, just let me know and I will stop. I'm about halfway through, so this will be sort of logical time to do it.
We do have a couple of questions if you'd like to take them now.
Okay.
Elka Enola, who you know, says, on February the 26th, I wrote, currently what we have is an internal battle for the balance of power within the very rich, very white North. That's still my view. Would you please comment on that?
Very white North, meaning the Northern Hemisphere, or we're talking about Ukraine? Northern Hemisphere, I assume.
Well, she wrote it on February the 26th, so I would imagine she's referring to the area affected by the conflict.
Well, I mean, if we're referring to the conflict in its broader terms, it could be argued, yes, that it's a battle between the forces of the West, NATO, led by United States, and say the forces of the East led by Putin. But I think this is a kind of Cold War perspective, and I don't see this particularly as a Cold War conflict. I think in today's world, if you're comparing the forces, China is a far more powerful player in the world economy than Russia is. The Russian economy has declined to the extent that it is approximately in its GDP on the same level as Italy. This is the sort of power economically that Russia wields today, and it's actually declining even further now with the sanctions that have taken place. In terms of, let's say, nations such as Africa or continents such as Africa not playing any major role in the world, but seeking to, I would agree with that statement. I think it is very much a Northern Hemisphere ruled world, and it's been that way since 1945, and perhaps even earlier than that. Essentially what we've perhaps seen is United States since 1945 taking a primary role, and then getting involved in a Cold War with the Soviet Union and reaching a kind of nuclear parity toward the end of that before the Soviet Union collapsed. Today, I see different things there, but Putin is very much bringing back Russian imperialism, which I'm going to emphasize in the later part of this talk. And therefore, I wouldn't agree with that statement completely.
Elka goes on to ask, it is my understanding that according to the Bucharest summit, April 3, 2008, Ukraine will become a member of NATO. If that is correct, would you please comment on that?
In 2008, NATO offered what it called a membership action plan to Georgia. And there was an agreement, I don't know whether it ever was put into written form, that this could be possibly extended to Ukraine too, but it never happened. And in fact, Russia's response to the offer to Georgia was to invade Georgia and occupy even its capital for a brief time, but they went all the way down to Gori, and two regions broke away from Georgia, the two regions I mentioned. So Russia is a strong opponent of that, obviously, and NATO members would have to agree unanimously if there was a Ukraine request to join NATO, and today that wouldn't happen. Several NATO members have said that they would not accept Ukraine as a member of NATO. So I don't think that's on the draft board at all for the near future. Although, of course, the number of Ukrainians that support membership of NATO has increased rapidly in the past few months, and actually over the past couple of years as well. It used to be around 30–40%, with around 60–70 opposed, and today it's more or less the reverse. About 70% of Ukrainians would like to be members of NATO, but no, it won't happen anytime soon.
Okay. Would you like to take two more questions, or shall I hold them?
I could take one more, I think.
Okay. Inga Numholt, my main question is whether control over Ukraine's natural resources is the key motivation underneath all the talk about security?
That's a good question. I think you might argue that Ukraine's natural resources in traditional terms, that is the older industries like coal and steel and chemicals concentrated in the Donbass, have effectively been under separatist control for the past 8 years. And that may be a reason why Russia has elected to keep those regions afloat and not allow Ukraine to retake them. But having witnessed the destruction of the past 8 years, and particularly of the last 2 months, it's hard to see how that is the case anymore. Ukraine's other resources, perhaps the Black Sea, yes, has some significant resources of gas and oil. It's known, of course, as a wheat belt. Its natural black earth soil has always been a factor, or was always a factor in the Soviet Union. Maybe this is what is in Russian interests. But security-wise, I would still put as the prime motive that Russia wants to control the Black and Azov seas and keep Ukraine landlocked, pushing it further and further inward. And the way Russia is carrying out the war, it would be quite illogical if its goal was to preserve the natural resources, like Azovstal, for example, one of the largest steelworks in Europe. The last part of Mariupol that's not been occupied by the Russian forces has been bombed repeatedly. So even if you want to grab that, you've still got to rebuild it again when the war is over, and that's going to take some time. So yes, but a qualified yes to that question.
Thank you. So there's
Okay.
many more that we'll have for the discussion after.
I'm sure there are. Yeah. This is a topic where there are bound to be a lot of questions, I think. So Mariupol was lost to Ukraine during the earlier fighting in 2014. It had briefly fallen into the hands of the separatists. And its recapture was perhaps Ukraine's greatest triumph in a losing war. The city is not only Ukraine's major port on the Azov Sea, but as I just mentioned, home to one of the country's largest steelworks. And much of the Donbass traditionally has been devoted to the coal industry. But why was it so critical for Russia to capture it? And why was so much propaganda in the Russian media devoted to it? And I think there are several reasons why Mariupol turned out to be important. First, once the majority of the city was captured, it represented a psychological breakthrough in a war that had gone very wrong hitherto in a number of ways. Excessive losses in the battlefield, extraordinary losses of higher officers, particularly generals, heavy casualties, the loss of Russia's most prestigious vessel in the Black Sea, the flagship cruiser Moskva, most likely the victim of 2 Neptune missiles fired by the Ukrainian side, and the failure to capture Kiev or remove the Ukrainian government led by Zelensky during the first days of the war. Second, the capture of Mariupol would leave Ukraine with only one major port open, namely Odessa, which would likely be the next target. And should Odessa be taken as well, it would deprive Ukraine of communications and important trade and allow Russia to use the Navy exclusively as backup for its armies. Third, and maybe the most important, Russia would obtain a land bridge connecting the Donbass region through Berdyansk to occupied Crimea. Though Russia built a bridge allowing road and rail links between mainland Russia and Crimea, it has been riddled with problems. Conquest of Mariupol, therefore, would allow the supply of water and food directly from the Donbass region to Crimea and create a swathe of territory in the eastern part of Ukraine firmly under Russian control. The same southern gains would later extend to Odessa region. One Russian leader even mentioned the possibility of the Russian army moving into the breakaway region of Transnistria, which is broke away from Moldova in the early 1990s. This, by the way, is Mariupol before the attack began. And sorry, this map shows the gradual advance of the Russian forces. It actually reminded me of Stalingrad too, like that newspaper article I cited, but from the opposite perspective. That is, with the Russians in the role of the Nazi forces and the Sea of Azov playing the role of the River Volga. And gradually, all the city be taken, apart from two little enclaves here and the steel plant in the east here. But this is a big area. This is about 11 square kilometers steelworks. It's an enormous place. The possible capture of the Azov battalion at Azovstal would also likely be a chance to scapegoat the battalion as a perfect example of the sort of neo-Nazis Russia is fighting today. And just as Nazis were paraded through the streets of Moscow in 1944 after Operation Bagration, so the battalion prisoners could follow suit in 2022. And clearly the idea then would be to replace the leadership in Kiev with some kind of puppet leadership from the pro-Russian segment of the Ukrainian parliament, such as the opposition Bloc for Life, which has now been banned incidentally, but without any real existence or independence. But even if the battalion is captured, it doesn't end the war at all, because Zelensky and the Ukrainian cabinet are alive in Kiev, giving speeches on social media to European, American, and Canadian parliaments, and demanding more sophisticated weapons from the United States and other members of NATO. So the capture of the city has catalyzed the second phase of the war, which concerns the consolidation and expansion of the Luhansk and Donetsk national republics and the advance of the Russian army to take all of those regions, and also to advance on Kharkiv and the army in the east, ideally then meeting the army from the west of the Donbass republics and trapping the Ukrainian forces in the middle. This, of course, is what the Russians intend to do, and whether they can do it is it's a moot point. I mean, it's not really clear that they can do that. The subjugation of Ukraine, if obtained without a lengthy delay, would allow Russia to turn to the next stage of the war. And it would perhaps then be focusing on reversing the expansion of NATO. One point that's been mentioned in the Russian media is forming a bridgehead to the isolated Kaliningrad region. But that, of course, could not be undertaken without occupying the territory of at least two of the Baltic states, Lithuania and Latvia, which are currently separating it from Russia. Just to show you the Azov battalion and why this is such a good propaganda thing for the Russians. I mean, it clearly looks like a Nazi army with these emblems, and they've been around now for about 8 years. Not all the members subscribe to far-right views, but certainly some units have done. And this has really not done the image of Ukraine any good whatsoever to have this army around. But it's still fighting, and at the moment, it's holding up the Russians and their allies, the Chechens, who have joined them to fight for Azovstal. Let's turn a little bit to the West now. First of all, the European Union. Because in Russian media narratives, the EU has become an officially designated enemy of the Russian state. Though EU unity in the face of the Russian attack was impressive and unusual, the official Russian narrative is that it contains deep divisions, as well as dependency on Russian energy resources for its economies to even survive. The electoral victory of Viktor Orban in Hungary in early April is perceived as the reinstallation of a certain ally, a good friend of Vladimir Putin and someone who has denounced Zelensky in the recent past. Also, Russia traditionally has had close relations with Italy as well. But the real key is Germany, with its heavy dependency on Russian gas, and the completed but suspended Nord Stream 2 pipeline from Viborg in northwestern Russia to Greifswald in the eastern part of Germany. And that's seen as an important factor in Germany's energy future. But Germany has taken a decisive step this past week to end dependence on Russian oil by the end of this year and stop imports of gas totally by the end of the decade. And that move would likely entail a complete alignment or realignment of past energy policy that has seen very close links between Germany and the Russian giant state company, Gazprom. To a lesser extent, similar plans have been undertaken by several other countries of the EU, which has relied on Russia for 40% of its energy needs until recently. So the entire EU now plans to phase out the consumption of Russian gas, oil, and coal in stages, and to reach that status by the end of the decade of the 2020s. Though linked with NATO and Eastern expansion, the EU itself is not a military power. Its significance lies in its economic and trading links with Russia and its role in the EU's Eastern Partnership project, which was initiated in 2009 and involved EU neighbors Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia. So Russia from that point began to compete with the EU for the allegiance of these states and for Ukraine and Belarus in particular. Today, Russia has expanded its influence and also its control over Belarus, from which the invasion of Ukraine was launched 2 months ago. Belarusian troops, however, have not yet taken part in the invasion of Ukraine. However, Lukashenko, the so-called president of Belarus, who actually lost the election in 2020, has recognized the annexation of Crimea by Russia. Ukraine has long stressed its wish to reduce its links with Russia and embrace the European Union. The Maidan uprising of 2013-14 arose from popular discontent with the decision of President Viktor Yanukovych not to sign the association agreement with the EU back in November 2013. President Zelensky has now called for Ukraine's immediate enrollment as an EU member, though the prospect is not immediate. The EU traditionally has required the reduction of corruption, modernization of factories, and a democratic system with free elections and a commitment to human rights as the basic criteria for membership. Ukraine fulfills only 2 of those, that is, a democratic system with free elections and commitment to human rights. For the first 2, with corruption and the state of the factories, they fell far short at the time when the war broke out. So the Eastern Partnership project, initiated by Sweden and Poland, featuring these 6 countries just mentioned, Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova, and the 3 states of the Caucasus, Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Moldova. And keep in mind that Moldova has the breakaway region of Transnistria, Georgia has the 2 breakaway regions, Abkhazia and South Ossetia. So there are frozen conflicts in Georgia and over here in Moldova as well. Vladimir Putin has claimed that the United States regarded Russia as an enemy even in 2017. The presidency of Donald J. Trump, which the Russians supported, brought a brief hope that relations could be mended. But the relationship with President Biden is as cold as at any time during the peak of the Cold War. Putin's mission is to restore parity between Russia and the United States by reducing the threat of NATO, which it regards as a US-controlled entity. And Russia also intends to occupy key areas that were formerly part of the Russian sphere, again, particularly during the time of the Russian Empire. There have been various stages in the decline of relations with NATO, and some of these acquired importance long after the event, such as the NATO bombing of Belgrade in 1999 and the formation of the state of Kosovo in 2008 at the expense of Russia's ally, Serbia. In turn, the United States' propensity for operating outside the confines of the UN, such as in its attack on Iraq in March 2003, when it sent an army of about 160,000 troops, 70% of whom were Americans, to remove the regime of Saddam Hussein. That action has rendered the UN ineffective as a body to maintain world peace. Russia has now continued that tradition by using its veto role in the UN Security Council to prevent any effective UN part in bringing the current war to an early end. Thus, while Ukraine is the immediate focus, Russian war aims are considerably broader, linked also to its role in Syria, where it has successfully maintained the regime of Assad, where he has now been in power for as long as Putin himself, and in fact, even longer if one takes into account the fact that his predecessor was his father, who also ruled for 2 decades. Russia's most important task is to redraw the boundaries of Europe before agreeing to any new peace agreement. There will be, in this perspective, no Ukrainian state, likely no Moldova, and possibly no Georgia either. Russia regards the expansion of NATO as an illegal action, betraying promises made to Russia by the United States back in 1990. Even Poland comes up often in conversations as a possible target, but with a population of over 40 million and full NATO membership there, it would be an unlikely scenario for Poland to be threatened. And I'm going to finish with 2 perspectives. What I consider now to be the realities. Russia's vision of the future is one founded on a disturbingly inaccurate and ill-informed interpretation of the past, including the Second World War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the expansion of NATO. A part of Russia's war may succeed, namely the occupation of all of Donetsk and Luhansk regions, and the consolidation of the 2 separatist governments. In fact, they've existed de facto for over 8 years without any real prospect of being returned to Ukraine. But even that is not to say that within these regions, there is any real desire for Russian occupation, or for that matter, for independence outside both Russia and Ukraine. The Donbass has its own traditions and outlook for sure, and they're not usually aligned closely with the governments in control of them, either in Moscow or in Ukraine. The opinion polls that have been conducted in the Donbass have also, well, I know of 2 polls in 2019 and 2020, both of which suggested that there was no enthusiasm for occupation in either of them. Elsewhere, Russian goals have failed spectacularly. Russian missiles have wreaked havoc on cities such as Kharkiv and Chernihiv in a pointless exercise of military power that belies any real concept of a special mission to liberate Ukraine. The Russian army and its allies have acted very badly towards civilians, raping women, massacring the innocent, and dumping them in mass graves. And the Russian president has even decorated the army unit responsible for the massacre of Bucha near Kiev. As a result, the enmity of Ukrainians toward Russia will likely continue for a generation, and there can be no prospect of Ukraine in any form dealing with Vladimir Putin as the leader of Russia. Some world leaders, including President Biden and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau of Canada, have concluded that the only plausible explanation of such behavior in Russia is one of seeking to eliminate Ukrainians as an ethnic group that is committing genocide, a term that is bandied around with frequency in social media. And this is the flag of the Donetsk People's Republic in the city of Donetsk. And it did generate some enthusiasm at the time. But once again, opinion polls suggest that the supporters of this government are in a minority. The leadership has changed several times. The last leader was assassinated with a rocket fired into his office, most likely by Russian forces. And this is the 64th Brigade responsible for the massacre at Bucha. And you can see the flag there in the foreground, which is the flag of the Republic of Sakha, earlier known as Yakutia. So these are special forces recruited from Eastern Siberia, and they all appear to be of Yakutian nationality. That's not to say that these represent the whole force, but certainly all the ones in this photograph are. And this republic is one of the richest in Russia. It's the largest republic, single republic inside Russia, but it only has about 1 million people. And finally, the Russian economy cannot sustain this war indefinitely. It's costing about $1 billion per day. Russia is not a great power. It's a military power with nuclear weapons. And that subject has never been far from Russian narratives. Putin brings it up frequently as a warning. But this, in my view, is a sign of weakness, not a sign of strength. It's like a last resort. Ultimately, if NATO gets too involved, we're going to use nuclear weapons. But obviously, that is a policy fraught with problems for Russia as well. Because if the war is escalated in that regard, Moscow would likely be the first target. Russia is already facing shortages, a plummeting ruble currency, and the gradual squeezing of oligarch wealth that sustains Putin and his acolytes in particular. Oligarchs have operated with impunity in Russia for 2 decades, buying property abroad, forming companies within companies to conceal ownership, offshore accounts, control of foreign banks in Cyprus and other countries, and controlling the state along with the intelligence forces elevated by Putin, who is in fact the most affluent oligarch of all. Today, to be frank, Western help to Ukraine has provided more rhetoric than substance, though there are some signs that United States and United Kingdom are starting to send now more sophisticated weapons. The West has clung to the hope that Russia might be satisfied with some concessions at Ukraine's expense, like recognition of occupied Crimea, recognition of the 2 breakaway regions, or the full occupation of the Donbass from Mariupol to Severodonetsk or Slavyansk. But in fact, there's no real endpoint or exit point for the Putin regime. It's not operating in a rational world in which diplomacy and reason plays a part. The goal is to win and occupy a vast territory and be recognized as a victorious conqueror that has restored the glory of Russia. It's a return to imperialism, in other words, in its crudest form. So thank you. I'm going to stop there. And I'm going to end the screen sharing.
Wow, that was a very in-depth analysis. So our first question is from David Ellis. Please discuss your perspective on nuclear weapons and the possibility they may be deployed. You may have just partially answered that one.
Yeah, I partially answered that. Yeah, it's possible, of course. And nuclear weapons have come up as a threat several times in the past, but it's never been really, other than the Cuban Missile Crisis, never been sort of real possibility, I think, of them entering into the equation. They've only been brought up by one side, which is Russia. And Russia, in terms of NATO, let's say, is not an equal power either. Nuclear weapons is the only area of all the weaponry that both sides possess in which Russia can match NATO in any way or any form. NATO is far superior militarily. So this is why I think it comes up quite a lot in discussions from Putin. But even, I mean, and also say, by the way, and I've not mentioned this in the talk because I don't want to be cited directly, but Putin himself seems in some sort of physical and mental decline, as you may have noticed from his press conferences, where earlier on as the war began, he sat at the end of this enormous long table, hunched over, while his Security Council members were all at the other end. And recently, sitting with Shoigu at a smaller table, how he seemed to cling to that table. And this has been noticed a few times, that his speech, his movement is not typical of Putin of the past. So I think you're looking at a man in some kind of crisis personally, as well as in this war. And that has led some people to suggest that in desperation, he might resort to using nuclear weapons. But if he did, I think there would be a response from NATO to nuclear weapons, just as there would be for the use of chemical weapons, which are far more likely to be used, I think, by Russia than nuclear weapons. And it would be the end of Putin. And it may be the end of the world if that happens too, but I don't see it quite coming to that point. I think there'd be far more likelihood of Putin being removed from within than using nuclear weapons.
Michael Berg comments that you have written a lot of books. Which book do you think is the most readable for those with no background on the topics covered?
That's a good question, Michael. Well, one of the books that came out most recently is a memoir called Understanding Ukraine and Belarus, and that just sort of describes my path as a scholar in both countries, but at the same time it describes what was happening in those two states throughout my academic career. So in other words, from the 1990s to the present. And in Belarus in particular, I think it goes into the opposition, and in Ukraine, it looks at some of the problems there too. And I didn't write that for an academic audience. I wrote it for a mass audience. So I would say that's the easiest one to read. And the publisher only allowed certain space because they didn't want me to write a massive book. They wanted a shorter one. So in both regards, I think that's fairly readable. Some of the others on specific topics, but I think maybe the two histories of, the history of Russia, the most recent one was called Russia in the 20th Century. I think that's quite readable as well. I've got some of my grad and honors students here in this audience. They would comment on that perhaps, but that seems to me also a possibility for books to read.
Okay. John Gray quotes some numbers about the forces, the military forces, and he says it looks like the Russians are outnumbered. So that leads to his question, what is the Russian objective? Since the Russian military has not committed sufficient forces to take and hold Ukraine.
You know, I asked the same question when the war began. How could this, I don't think it was even 250,000, it was more like 150 that were in place when the war began. And I wanted to know how an army of that size could hope to occupy a country the size of Ukraine. And I don't think it can, but they do have enormous reserves. I mean, Russia could call up everyone up to the age of 45, perhaps, something like that, and create a much larger army. I'm not sure of the figure for the Ukrainian army either, because the figure I had was about 120,000 regular troops, and a much similar number for the reserves. And if you look at the numbers for weapons of every description, Russians have far more missiles than Ukraine, far more advanced weaponry than Ukraine. And Ukraine can only hope to resist by getting that same weaponry from the West. But I do agree that if the Ukrainians continue fighting, as they have done so far, Russia will not win this war. And there's simply no way it could win this war. And the performance of the regular ground troops, the conscripts, has been fairly pathetic. I mean, when they came into Kherson region, several units simply gave up. Others asked for food. Others went on robbery missions, robbing banks, robbing stores and things like that, suggesting they were desperate for food. They didn't have enough food to eat and were hardly trained at all as well. So in every regard, they don't look very good. And Russia has been relying on Chechens. It's now brought in some Syrians. And it will no doubt try to conscript members of the occupied population. And a former grad student of mine who's living in Kherson region now told me that this is already rumored, that the Russians are going to start calling up Ukrainians from the local population and forcing them to serve in the Russian army, which is illegal by the Geneva Convention. And it makes one wonder just how loyal those people would be if they get into the Russian army. But it's a good point, John. I think that's worth mentioning.
Jim Hudson asks, do you think this war will escalate into World War III? You may have partially answered that one.
Yeah, I don't think so. And I don't think it's on that kind of global level at the moment. NATO has deliberately refused to send any ground troops onto Ukrainian territory because it's not a NATO member. So the official policy is that this is not a NATO war. If Russia should attack the Baltic states or attack, say, Poland, then that would be a different matter. But so far, in the 22 years that Putin has been around, he has never actually set foot in one of the NATO countries. I mean, he's kind of buzzed the airspace and things like that. But he's also created a backlash so that Sweden and even Finland now is wanting to join NATO. And that would be reversing a policy that goes all the way back to 1948 when Finland decided to be a neutral state, and quite successfully as well worked with Russia as a neutral state. So it's ironic in a way that Putin has really done his best to unify Ukraine, and he's also played a big role in unifying Western Europe against Russia as well. But I don't think it will go that far.
Raj Krishnan asks, do you have any opinion on India's purchase of discounted oil from Russia? Do you know why India is reluctant to condemn the invasion? Yeah,
India has been an important client of Russia for a long time and relied on Russia to build up its defense in what is essentially an ongoing war with Pakistan that never has really ended, and they're both nuclear powers as well. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union supplied India, and the United States, for the most part, supplied Pakistan. It wasn't exactly as black and white as that all the way through the Cold War, but essentially that was what was happening. And the Soviet Union also supported India in the border wars it fought with China in 1950s and 1970s. So, you know, India and Russia are quite close in many ways. And I think Modi and Putin personally get along pretty well as well. And of course, one could ask the same question. I don't know if anybody does, and maybe they will, but I think China is another issue that we might discuss.
Right, that's the next question. Mark McWilliam, what, if any, connection do you see between this conflict and a possible Chinese invasion of Taiwan?
Well, I'm not an expert on China, but I did listen to a Chinese speaker the other day. here at the University of Alberta, she didn't link them up. She said that Taiwan has always been on China's horizon, and that China has never made any secret about the fact that it regards Taiwan as an integral part of China. And most of the world recognizes China today, and China occupies the seat in the UN Security Council where it replaced Taiwan back in the early 1970s. So it's had that for some time. So China in a way is not prompted, I think, to take any rapid action. And the Chinese speaker also suggested that the situation is a little awkward for China because China has traditionally been close to both Russia and Ukraine, and it would like to continue trade with them both. Therefore, in the long term, China would not want to see this war going on for too long. And it raised the question in my mind whether, in fact, China could play an alternative role, which is of a mediator in the war, given some time perhaps. But if it goes on for a longer period, as it looks like doing, China would be a logical mediator because it would be one acceptable to Russia. I'm not sure whether China at the moment will be acceptable to the United States because they would have to remend their relationship, which is in total mess right now. But that's where I see it happening. And eventually, you know, probably China would retake Taiwan, but I don't think they'll link it to Putin taking Ukraine.
Hafner asks, if Putin goes for whatever reason, who do you think will come in his place?
Well, I have to get a little crystal ball to answer that one, I think. At the moment, the Russian political system is fairly secure. Putin's popularity has actually gone up since the war started. The Security Council is in effective control. So if Putin stepped down, you would anticipate that the Security Council would appoint someone to take over. It wouldn't necessarily be the prime minister. I could see that happening. And Russia is an authoritarian state. It's not likely to suddenly transform into some kind of Western-style democracy. Russians were traumatized in the 1990s by Boris Yeltsin's presidency, which turned into a period of total anarchy, with oligarchs buying up most of the country, gang wars in the streets of Moscow, financial collapse in 1998. And this is all attributed to an attempt to bring in a shock therapy in the market economy, to transform to a market economy almost overnight. And Putin, for many, brought stability when he came in. And partly by good fortune, because oil and gas prices, which are the basis of the Russian economy, rose dramatically after Putin became president. And Russia was able to erase all its debts pretty quickly. But Putin has managed to associate himself with that stability, and as a kind of strongman who defeated the Chechens, he ended that war in Chechnya, and he's always acted aggressively to any threat to Russia. But if he's undermined from within, then I would think it would be somebody from the security forces, and you'd probably get another strongman type in power. And I use that man word from, I'm not being anti-gender there. All the Russian leaders have only ever been men since the start of the century, start of the 20th century, I should say. So it's a society that in many ways is traditional, authoritarian, orthodox, based on family values, and has a demand for stability, economic progress, and order. And I think Putin so far has brought most of those, but if there's economic collapse, or if the oligarchs feel they're completely undermined and turn on Putin, then you could see some change. But again, I think it would still be a fairly authoritarian society.
Jose Beltran asks, what chances do you see of having Sweden and Finland enter NATO in the midterm?
Well, I think NATO members might consider that favorably. I mean, they're both advanced economies. Sweden's neighbor Norway has been a neighbor, been a part of NATO from the beginning, and still maintain decent relations with Russia, incidentally, up to this point. And I think Finland joining NATO would be like a red flag to Russia. But on the other hand, I don't think that Finland is perceived by Putin in particular in the same way that Ukraine is perceived, as, in other words, as part of the same state, same people. So I think it would cause some aggravation or anger in Russia, but I think it could happen quite quickly if it was a matter of just NATO agreeing to it.
Stephen Kleinman asks, some have said that if NATO had not expanded in Eastern Europe, if it had been nicer to Russia, then Russia would be less hostile now. Do you agree?
Yeah, probably. Probably that's the case. But I would also keep in mind that when Putin first came into power, I think it was 2001, he said that expanded NATO is no threat to Russia. We don't perceive any threat from NATO. It's only more recently where he's brought back the issue of NATO expansion. And he's gone back to 1999 and then the expansion in 2004 as evidence, as to back up his arguments that NATO is the cause of the problems, that NATO has expanded. But NATO has never really threatened Russia directly. And most of the new members of NATO are in NATO because they want it to be. I mean, there's no indication that the Baltic states, for example, had any reluctance about joining NATO. They wanted to be in there from the beginning, and so did Poland. And in both cases, it was because of fear of Russia. And NATO therefore agreed to do that. But I can remember, although this is before I became a professor or anything like that, but I can remember in 1990, NATO had a meeting in Brussels that debated whether it had any reason for its existence anymore, whether it should simply disband itself. And it could have done. If it had disbanded itself then, we might be looking at a rather different sort of world today. But ultimately it decided that although things looked good in 1990, there was still the potential for change, and therefore they would remain in place. And then the expansion started. So I think it is a cause of some of the tension today. But of course, it's using the benefit of hindsight to say that the situation would be different if NATO had not expanded. It's impossible to say.
Jose Beltran asks, in your opinion, is Lukashenko's position as the president of Belarus really secure?
I don't think it is secure. At the moment, Lukashenko has become something of a puppet of Russia. It's a president who is in office against the wishes of most of his population. And he's maintained power by brute force. And he's done that by cracking down on demonstrators with his security forces, with the KGB, OMON troops, beating and torturing protesters, imprisoning them. They have the largest number of political prisoners ever in Belarus, even more than during the Soviet period. And many Belarusians who are not in prison have simply fled the country and are now living in exile in different countries of Europe. Lukashenko became dependent on Putin. He asked Putin for a $1.5 billion loan. It comes with conditions attached. And since that time, in recent weeks, Lukashenko has been desperately trying to create some kind of space for himself to operate that is not controlled by Russia. He's issued a referendum for a new constitution. The constitution is largely modeled on the Russian constitution, but it's created a kind of people's assembly that would be under the president's control, and that would more or less take over the functions of today's parliament. So he's in a corner himself, and he's trying to create some space between Belarus and Russia to avoid a complete Russian takeover. But the chances are that at some point, Russia will tire of Lukashenko. I mean, they've had him a long time. He's brought no real benefits to Russia other than the fact that he's not a member of the opposition parties and he's not anti-Russian, he's pro-Russian. But otherwise, he could be seen sooner or later as a burden because the population of Belarus has been largely pro-Russian or at least sympathetic to Russia. But that is beginning to go down as long as Lukashenko remains in power. So it may be in Russia's interest sooner or later to think about a new leader in Belarus.
John Gray asks, when the Russian invasion force ceases to be a threat to the Ukraine, how long can sanctions on Russian food exports continue? There are countries dependent on Russian wheat. Rising commodity prices will force poorer countries to pay more to get less. With crop failures, there's the possibility of actual starvation. Could this explain the disinterest of those countries that will suffer collateral damage and reduce the influence of the United States and Europe?
Well, I mean, keep in mind that at the moment, Russia is a grain importer, not exporter. So in other words, Russia is reliant on places like Argentina and Canada for wheat for its own population. If the question refers though to Ukraine or Russian occupied Ukraine, then it takes on a different dimension. You could say then that there would be some food problems. I was thinking here in Canada, by the way, today, what do we actually have that we're going to miss out on if Ukrainian products are completely barred from Canada? And the most obvious one is sunflower oil, right? Most of the sunflower oil that we buy in the stores comes from Ukraine. But otherwise, I don't think it wouldn't affect our world so much, but it would affect some parts. But I don't think it's on the same scale as Russian gas and oil. I mean, this is really where it would hit the hardest if, say, German homes were suddenly lacking gas in a winter period. I mean, it's not so bad now, but when it gets to the fall and winter, if the gas supply is completely cut off and there's no sort of backup energy or electricity production or gas production, then I think there will be a lot of suffering.
Stephen Cloudman asks if you think Russia will eventually win the war, and in particular, will they take the Odessa region?
I don't think Russia will win the war, no. I think at most they could temporarily occupy parts of Ukraine. But no matter which parts are occupied, and I'll qualify that by saying west of the two separatist republics, no area west of the two separatist republics would accept in any form Russian control of their state. So if the fighting, active fighting ended, you would likely get a guerrilla warfare continuing for years and years, just as was the case in Afghanistan. It's simply misreading the views of Ukrainians, I think, to start a war like this, where there's no way out, there's no conceivable way out, but there's no way to win either. There's simply no way to win. Russia could possibly occupy Odessa. I doubt it myself. They've not shown themselves capable of occupying a large city for any length of time. And even if it does, the same thing would happen there, I believe, as well. Crimea, it's been possible to occupy and keep, but Crimea has a Russian majority population. It's got the Black Sea Fleet protecting it, which I suppose Odessa would have as well. And Ukraine has not really made any effort either to defend it when it was annexed or retake it, other than to complain a lot in international assemblies. Maybe impossible. But I see limitations to what Russians can take. And even if they do take it, they won't be able to hold it indefinitely.
Sandra Baumann-Trompe in Germany asks, do you think this is mainly Putin's war, or is there a common Russian interest or interest of a Russian political party to keep this war going?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say it's probably Putin's war, first and foremost, or maybe Putin and his Security Council, because I think his defense minister is probably even more extreme than he is in terms of his war goals. But I don't see any real backing. I mean, the parliament in Russia is pretty much controlled by the presidency anyway, and the president's Unified Russia Party and other allied parties that have controlled parliament now since Putin came to power. So it doesn't really seem to me that there is any other source of power in Russia outside the presidency. And Putin has focused very narrowly. I mean, he wrote an article on his own website in last July. And in this article, he gave an entire history of Ukraine from sort of the 10th century to the present. And in each part of it, tried to show that Ukraine was simply part of Russia, that this was a Russian state. And he said there was no such thing as Ukraine. So that Ukraine, the name Ukraine arose because it means borderland. And that's what it was. It was simply a borderland between Russia and other states. And I mean, this is pretty damning stuff that appeared on the president's own website. It's not something anyone has invented. This is what Putin thinks. But very rarely do you see a leader who tries to put his innermost thoughts into direct action and try to bring it to reality. And as I tried to show in the talk, it's as far from reality as you could really get. We've gone back 2 centuries, basically, and no one really thinks in the same way. On the other hand, the Russian population is only getting this view of the war as a special military operation. If you read the Russian media, it doesn't occupy the whole media. It doesn't always occupy the front page. You get a column, perhaps bottom right or something like that, on Russia's war in Ukraine, just showing you where the latest Russian advances are, or some horrendous act carried out by the Ukrainian forces. And the rest of it is news from the rest of the world or from Russia. It's not central, in other words, to the Russian media or the media reading public or social media reading public in Russia, which is totally propagandized at the moment and doesn't see what the sort of perspective that we get in the West. And that's not to say that we're totally objective either, because we're not. But at the same time, if you read both, I think you can get a much broader view of how to perceive the war. So at the moment, there's no urgency in the population. There's no sort of crisis taking place at the moment, other than that the West is cutting some things off.
Jane Robertson asks, could Russia break apart?
It could. I mean, it's threatened to do that before. In 1991, it seemed to be quite possible for parts of Russia to break off. Putin has developed certain partnerships. He's appointed his own governors in the 7 regions. And in fact, he also designated the 7 regions of Russia back in 2000. And therefore, he's got close allies right across the country. When he ended the Chechen war, it was with Ramzan Kadyrov, his close ally, as the new president of Chechnya. That alliance has remained, and it stopped the kind of tribal conflict that used to dominate Chechnya as an ethnic republic within Russia for the moment. But that could always break out again if central Russia collapses, as could similar demands in places like Tatarstan, where you have significant resources that would benefit the local Tatar population. So it's possible. It's possible. I mean, it would require an economic downturn of unprecedented proportions. And also, I think, some kind of devastating defeat for the Russian army that was clearly visible to the population for this kind of thing to happen. And I don't think we're anywhere near there yet.
Matt Crawford asks, do you know of any reasons to suppose that Russia's nuclear forces are more functional than its conventional forces? After all, there has been no testing in 30 years.
Yeah. I've been thinking along the same lines as well, but my follow-up would be, do you dare to risk it? You cannot sort of base policy in the hope that maybe a missile won't leave its base or something like that. I would imagine that they have usable forces and that they're quite willing. I mean, they just tested a weapon the other day out in, I believe it was Petropavlovsk, which Putin then said, was better than any NATO weapon and could counter any effort to shoot it down. It goes straight to the target and it could hit USA. He made this boast the other day. So I think they've got enough weapons. They're a dangerous state in that regard. If you get into the realms of nuclear conflict, yeah, you don't want to do that with Russia. Even though not all the weapons may be as active and efficient as you might think.
Jahangir Jarawala, known as JD, asks, is there any hope for de-escalation and diplomacy? And if so, what are the key points of a shared and peaceable solution?
Yeah, well, I agree that needs to be thought about very carefully. And so far, just 2 countries have tried to act as a mediator, other than, of course, the failed efforts of President Macron, who may or may not have been re-elected today, I don't know. And that is Turkey and Israel. And although they're important countries, and Turkey especially strategically is in a very important region on the Black Sea, they may not be powerful enough to stop the war, stop the efforts in the war immediately. And that's why I think you would need a larger mediator like China before you could really bring the fighting to a stop. It's obvious to me that the UN is not going to be the vehicle to stop the war. As long as you've got a Security Council on the basis it was created in 1945, with veto power given to the so-called 5 victorious nations of the Second World War. And that situation has been in place now for 80 years. You would need to completely alter the UN Security Council for the UN to play any role in becoming a mediator. I think there's always hope, and Zelensky several times has offered to mediate with Putin. Putin has not been interested in coming to the table so far. Whether that will change, I don't know. But at the moment, Putin is not likely to back down because he hasn't achieved any of his immediate aims, such as occupying all of the Donbass or bringing down the government in Kiev. He hasn't even completely seized Mariupol, for that matter. So I don't think he's going to stop yet.
Jean-Paul Como remarks that on January 26, the exchange rate between the ruble and the US dollar was 79. As of today, it's 77. So do economic sanctions hurt that much?
I don't know. I mean, some things hurt, others don't, and they hurt certain sectors of the population rather than others. This was the problem, I think, with when sanctions were applied to Belarus too, after the presidential elections, is who are the people who are going to suffer by issuing these sanctions? And is it the people who are actually producing goods in factories, or is it the leadership of the country? You have to hit the places where goods are exported, the modes of export. And to my mind, sanctions have never worked fully in any case. They're a sort of symbolic gesture against the target nation. These are the heaviest sanctions ever used against any state by the West. And Russia is a state that has traded heavily and exported heavily to the EU and other countries. So it's obviously had to find backup. And if the Europeans can manage without Russian gas or oil, it would hurt Russia in the long term. It really would. Because Russia would have to look for new markets all the time and in different places of the world. And Russia has these connections by pipeline with Germany and other countries. They're already established. These pipelines run through the Baltic Sea, they run through Belarus, they run through Ukraine. And they actually haven't stopped running, even though this war is going on. So these haven't actually stopped yet. And if they do stop, there will be a crisis, I think, not only in Russia, but in most of the world as well. This is the kind of immediate future, I think, that we face from these sanctions against Russia. But it's hard to know exactly what would be a better policy against Russia without resorting to a direct intervention.
Cody Ritter, your student, has answered your request for a student's perspective on your books as being readable for the general public. He says, I have read Russia in the 20th Century by Dr. Marples, and it is a nice overview of Russia's journey over the past century. As the title suggests, however, its focus is on the Soviet Union, with only the last 3 chapters looking at the transition to democracy and capitalism and touching on Putin. It was published in 2008 or 2010.
Thanks, Cody. Appreciate that.
There you go. Okay. Patrick Badagelli. A few days ago, this is another of your students. A few days ago, historian Timothy Snyder wrote that Moscow is the center of fascism in our world. Do you think that it is an accurate assessment of the modern Russian state, or is it perhaps drawing too strong of a parallel with World War II?
Yeah, I actually do think that's going too far to call Russia a fascist state. I've always called it an authoritarian state. But Tim definitely has developed a kind of theory of the Western world as upholders of democratic freedom against the kind of fascist Russia and the sort of gloom and doom tyranny scenario, that Russia is painted completely in black and the West completely in white. And the answer to me has always been that there's a lot of gray areas as well. And we've seen in the past that Russia has some politicians who do not agree with the Putin line. Alexei Navalny is the obvious one. He's expressed his views quite openly until his recent imprisonment. Russia has always had people who've spoken out against the government. In 2012, there were mass demonstrations against Putin. In 2020, there were mass protests in Khabarovsk at the appointment of a pro-Putin governor there. Different parts of Russia have expressed anger against the war. I've forgotten the number of people arrested in Russia for protesting against the war, but it's in the thousands. I think it's around 14,000 people arrested in Russia for protesting against this war. That's a huge number of people to arrest. So it suggests to me there are people in Russia who can't be stereotyped as sort of proto-fascists who support some kind of dictatorial regime led by Putin. And, you know, probably if you're looking at any population in any open election, Putin maybe has got the adherence of, 40% to 50% of the population right now. But that's because most people don't vote based on political views. They vote based on their economic situation. And until recently, Russia's economic situation has been stable. People there live better, say, than in Ukraine or Moldova. In the cities, at least, the living standards are much higher. In the countryside, it's a different matter. So I don't think it's fair to paint all of Russia as Putin, as sort of Putin regime. It's not. I've always differentiated, and I think others do as well.
Michael Berg asks, should Europe stop receiving gas from Russia together with some kind of social program to prevent people from dying from freezing to death?
I think it should. And I think Germany is leading the way, and Germany's now plans to move much more to renewable sources of energy, such as wind and solar. It's a major, major exercise that will take, I agree, will take until the end of the 2020s to bring that off. But I think it's in the best interests of countries to do that. I think in Canada, we should do that as well. Even though I come from the oil and gas center of Canada, here in Alberta, I do think that renewable sources are the long-term answer to energy. And therefore, it is necessary for the Europeans to think along the same lines. And yes, social programs will probably have to be increased as well in different countries of Europe. I'm not sure that how quickly the loss of Russian gas, and it really is, gas is a bigger one than oil, whether that could actually be compensated anytime immediately. You know, it might take a little longer. There's also another related question where the Germans have been before, and that is, should they develop nuclear power? And they've always been very strong on environmental groups and said, no, we don't want any nuclear power in Germany. That's another thing that they might start to rethink as well.
And the final question comes from your student, Katerina Lozga.
Katerina, that's not my student, but she's a good colleague and friend.
Okay, thank you for the clarification. To what extent do parallels between the current war of Russia against Ukraine, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, or the Cold War invasions of Czechoslovakia in '68 and Hungary '56, further our understanding of the potential outcomes of Russia's aggression?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can relate all of these to the current war in some ways. Afghanistan is a nice analogy because there is quite clearly a foreign country. It's not even in the Soviet Union. And it's not really considered to be in the Russian sphere directly, or anybody else's sphere for that matter. And you've got a case where a Soviet army comes in, but is actually in a minority and opposed by most of the population, even though the local army initially is not as strong as the invading force. And that was a long drawn out war that ended in total disaster for the Soviet armies. I mean, total disaster. This was the Vietnam of the Soviet Union. In terms of the other one she mentions, I think Hungary in 1956 was a violent war that saw some resistance and a lot of deaths. But there as well, and in Czechoslovakia, Russia used the pretext that this was a Warsaw Pact invasion, and therefore their allies were invading at the same time. And I remember I don't remember 1968, but the Czechoslovaks were very upset at the idea of being invaded from East Germany, because it reminded them of what had happened back in the late 1930s when the Germans came in from the East. So this was a broader war, I would say, than the current one. Russia, though, in the same way, is trying to get allies to join them in this campaign against Ukraine, but so far has only come up with Syrians. And Chechens were, of course, technically Russians as well, since they're part of the Russian Federation. So yeah, I think it's measurable in these fashions, and that Russia is suffering the same kind of problems in Ukraine as it suffered then, if a war goes on for a long time. In other words, the longer this war goes on, the better it really is for Ukraine, providing they're not suffering too much. And the worse it is for Russia because they're spending all the money. And as I think it was John or Michael, one of the earlier writers said, the army is not actually big enough to sustain the entire occupation of Ukraine in its present form. So I think it's comparable.
So Professor Marples, on behalf of Toronto Mensa, please accept our thanks for your very in-depth analysis of this current Russia-Ukraine situation. We're honored to have had the benefit of your expertise on this subject that's gripping the world's attention. And I don't think I've mentioned this to you before, but as a sign of our appreciation, we will be sending you a small gift.
Oh, well, thank you very much. It was a pleasure, and they were a great set of questions. And it was just like being in one of my classes, actually, the questions coming up, because we've spent so much time online, right, in the past year, that this is the way I've normally got the questions in classes as well, in not last term in particular, but the term before. So I appreciated them, and I hope I answered them as satisfactorily as you can do about something that's still in progress, because I think that's the thing to note. This is something still in motion, and really any predictions could be proved wrong tomorrow. And this is why I'm a historian, not a political scientist.
Various people are putting in lots of wonderful thank yous, and I'm going to send you all of it so you will have a record of it.
Okay, thank you. And thank you everyone for coming. I appreciate it.
And thank you from me also for this fantastic audience today. So
Okay,
I'll say goodbye now. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks,
Bye for
Kathleen.
now.